Hello, this is the PowerPoint lecture on basic ethical frameworks and conflict. This is going to be a little bit long. I do teach ethics and communication ethics. They're each full semester programs, so I had to try to pull the highlights of basic ethical frameworks and then tie them back to how they fit in with conflict resolution. This is just a skimming overview of the world of ethics. What are ethics? Ethics is the study of moral philosophy. Philosophy is the school of study that examines how we think about things. So moral philosophy is how we think about right and wrong. So how do we answer the question, what's the right thing to do? Socrates said it's the study of how we ought to live. So over the years, people have developed very different schools of ethical thought, that is, different general approaches to how we go about deciding what is right or wrong. And most of us use different ethical schools of thought in different situations. What's nice about studying ethics is then you start to identify that in yourself. In this situation, I tried to make everybody happy. In this other situation, I said, no, I have to look out for my own self-interest first, and that's the right thing to do here. So you use different schools of thought to figure out what was right or wrong in different situations. Many public and personal conflicts arise out of equally caring, equally well-meaning, intelligent people applying different schools of ethical thought to a problem to get to very different answers. So, starting with our different schools of ethical thought, let's start with concepts of relativism and absolutism. Moral absolutists assert that there are absolute, unbreakable rules of acceptable behavior, and they often base right or wrong on law, religion, tradition, or culture, and this can lead to entrenched positions in a conflict. I can't make my barn any smaller than X number of cubits because my religious text says all barns have to be X number of cubits. That's hard to negotiate around. Creates an interesting entrenched position in a conflict called stonewalling, where there's something immovable that you have to deal with. And we'll talk about ways to try to work with those types of positions. Moral relativists assert that the question of right or wrong depends on circumstances. This can provide more flexibility in conflict resolution, but can also make it more difficult to build in accountability and develop trust between the parties. If I say that, well, how much effluent we're going to pump out of this sewage treatment plant into Lake Champlain, it's going to depend on the weather, or it's going to depend on, what's going on, or whether one of our operators is on vacation that week. And so, we'll say, we'll put out X amount, but it's got to depend. We need flexibility. That's kind of a relativist situation that makes it hard to come to a firm agreement. Utilitarianism is a school of ethical thought that looks for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is probably the most predominant school of ethical thought, particularly in politics and the public realm. A little bit of history. There are 3 different versions of utilitarianism over the years. Hedonism, back from the days of Epicurus and ancient Greece, said, you should maximize pleasure. So hedonism says wine, women, and song, sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever makes you feel good, do it. And that's the highest ultimate right thing. Then came along the Scots in the 1600s, 1700s. Jeremy Bentham said, well, you should maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. And happiness can include that physical pleasure, but can include other sorts of happiness as well, like owning land and being rich. John Stuart Mill came along after that and said, well, we need to have a quality scale on this because everyone in Rome was happy at the gladiator games watching people be slaughtered in the arena, and that's very lowbrow pleasure, and that we need to maximize high quality social values like freedom and art and autonomy. So the greatest good for the greatest number, and Mill's position would, include sort of elevated notions of cultural values. So utilitarianism is actually a consequential form of ethics that looks to the ultimate outcome of an action to determine if something is right or wrong. At the end of the day, does it make the most people the most happy? Biggest problem with utilitarianism is that sacrificing one or sacrificing the minority for the happiness of the majority is acceptable under this school of thought. Examples may include scapegoating, and if you want a great movie on this, watch Breaker Morant, real life story taken from the trial transcripts, end of the Boer Wars, and the powers that be basically needed to show that in fact there had been abuses with local residents, and so they basically picked a couple of their army guys to be the scapegoats and to be tried for murder and executed so that they could make a big show out of saying that the country and the government as a whole wasn't killing colonists. It was these couple of rogue people, and we've taken care of them and punished them. And it's all about their trial. Ethnic cleansing, another example. The people of a country may be really, really happy if we only moved out that, band of people of a different ethnicity or race who look different or talk different or have a different skin color, and if we just threw them out of the country, we'd all be so much happier. That's a utilitarian solution that I'm sure all of us would agree is unethical. Deontology, or duty ethics, looks at the right or wrong of a particular act rather than at its consequences. And its founder, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, set out these three primary elements. Number one, universal maxim. It's right if you'd be content living in a world where everyone acted this way all of the time. So that's probably something similar to something you've heard your mom or grandma say about, if everyone else was doing it, would you do this too? Number two, never use people as a means to an end. So respect individual autonomy of every person equally. Don't require anything of someone for the benefit of someone else. And lastly, always act out of duty. That is, if you were in that person's shoes, what would you want them to do for you? And not out of charity or paternalism or empathy or fear. Kant really wanted you to put your emotions aside and act through critical reasoning, determine what other people needed based on their position and their needs in respecting their autonomy and their decisions, and do for them what you were able to do that they needed. Lots of conflicts between utilitarian and deontological perspectives. I'm just going to give you some examples for you to think about in the privacy of your own home. If moving one family from their home lets us build a hydroelectric dam to provide free power to millions of people, is it right or wrong to force that one family to move? How about if bombing a few towns or a few cities, say in Japan or more recently in the Balkans, stops a war? Is it right or wrong? Or how about if firing 100 state workers cuts the payroll budget so that the rest of the state workers can stay employed for now? Is that right or wrong? Each one of these questions would be answered quite differently from a utilitarian perspective and from a deontological perspective. Egoism is another consequential school of ethics. It was established by the modern philosopher Ayn Rand. It's been popularly embraced by right-leaning politicians, vilified by folks on the left as supposedly supporting selfishness and laissez-faire capitalism. Ayn Rand said that what is right is what is in your own well-reasoned best self-interest. So lying in negotiations so that you can win may have a short-term gain, but it's going to destroy the relationship going forward, probably destroy your reputation. So actually it's not in your own best self-interest. It's kind of utilitarianism, but with an understanding that we can't ever really fully know what's right for others, so we have to use ourselves as a measuring stick of what's right or wrong, because we can only truly know ourselves. Ayn Rand also said, never sacrifice your life or your work or your time or your soul to someone else's purposes in life. This is very similar to Immanuel Kant's respecting self-autonomy, but for yourself instead of other people. Instead of saying always respect others' autonomy, Ayn Rand says respect your own autonomy first. Conflicts that involve egoism are often those conflicts of self-care versus the needs of others. So despite being popularly vilified, egoism is the only school of ethical thought that asserts that self-care and self-protection need to be preeminent when they conflict with the needs of others. So, according to egoism, do not accept being abused for the sake of the children or the family. Don't be forced into an arranged marriage or undesired career path to make the family happy. Don't sacrifice your health working late because the company needs me. Each of these is a direct conflict with what the utilitarian solution would be to these issues. Egoism effectively says put your own oxygen mask on first before assisting other passengers, which we've all heard on a plane, and that's basically what egoism says. Totally different school of ethics that's not consequential or act-based, duty-based ethics is Aristotle's character ethics, called Nicomachean Ethics, because it was written by Aristotle in the form of a letter to his son Nicomachus to tell him how he ought to live. Dear son, as you go off to college, here's how you ought to behave. It focuses not on acts, but on being a good person. And it strongly implies that the acts of a virtuous person are always right. So Aristotle says adopt habits of virtue rather than vice, by which he means habits of moderation. Moderation is an action in the middle between two vices, and vices are too much or too little of something. I've given you two quick examples here. One is that the virtue of patience is between the two vices, one being impatience and the other, I don't know what you would call it, but willing to wait forever without results. The second example I gave you there is bravery. The virtue of bravery sits between the vice of cowardice and the vice of being foolhardy. All right, and according to Aristotle, the most valued virtues are leadership, scholarship, and public service. So how Aristotle continues to shape conflicts in our culture today, mainly our culture still inherently has a really hard time believing that good people, particularly those who are prominent like doctors, coaches, politicians, priests, movie directors, would do bad things. And yet our culture still is really inclined to swiftly believe that people who are not socially prominent, like people who are unemployed or not English speaking or work in physical labor, are more inclined to be bad people. This continues to perpetuate class and race divides in our culture. There have been some changes in recent years where we have been seeing coaches, prominent coaches, priests, movie directors, being called into account for things like sexual assault, theft. We've seen some companies like Volkswagen be charged with fraud. And those are still remain the exceptions, and it took a very long time of a lot of people making reports before we got there. Rights philosophy arises in the 1700s Enlightenment era and says every human is endowed with certain power to preclude other people, including government, from doing harm to them. In other words, my right to life stops you or the government from killing me without legal consequences. And human rights declarations are effectively a codification of Kant's respect for individual autonomy. Rights are often in conflict. Many conflicts arise over competing rights or different perspective on rights, ranging from abortion to zoning to criminal sentencing. Here's a couple of examples. If my right to do what I want on my land involves playing loud music late at night, your right to do what you want on your land involves meditating in silence, our rights are in conflict. So whose rights should prevail? My right to use whatever language I want in a public place, whatever, epithets, foul language, racial or ethnic slurs, foul gender language, in a public place conflicts with your right of dignity and to use those public places without being harassed for your right of religion or race or gender. Whose rights should prevail? I wanted to mention the real ultimate imbalances of power and those ethics in conflict resolutions where is something really a conflict, or is it something far beyond that, where someone is so in the wrong and holding the other hostage, literally or figuratively, that we should not expect them to actually come to a negotiation? So one problem of conflict resolution, as set out in books like Getting to Yes, is that there is a bit of a privileged presumption to it that there is at least some semblance of a balance of power and autonomy of the parties coming into the negotiation. But when the heavily armed kidnapper says, "on your knees or I shoot you," it's very difficult to work collaboratively and engage in principled negotiation and reach a just and equitable solution. If, you kidnap me and say, "I'm cutting off your arm at the shoulder," if you just, walk up to me on the street, I don't know you from Adam, we have no prior beef, and you say, "I'm going to hatchet your arm off of the shoulder," and I say, "No, you're not," and you say, "Well, we'll compromise, I'll cut it off at the elbow," that's not really a negotiation, is it? I mean, how would you characterize that as a conflict? So question to think about, is this a conflict of autonomous parties who can choose to work together collaboratively in principled negotiation? Or is one of the parties actually being held hostage by the other with a profound imbalance of power? When, 800,000 or more people were slaughtered in Rwanda in 3 months' time in 1994, was this a conflict that the murderers and their victims should have sat down to attempt to resolve? Would we have expected the Tutsis to compromise and allow, say, 400 or 500,000 people to be slaughtered instead of, 800 or 1,000 or 1,000,000? Is it a conflict? It's a conflict, but I think we need to be careful about how we think about it and how we characterize it, and in the context of what's an appropriate venue, what does conflict resolution look like in that situation? And there may be a short time resolution where you're trying to negotiate a hostage type negotiation where you're trying to end this horrible situation. But then are we in the realm of conflict resolution? Or are we in the realm of justice and forensic evaluation of making up for past wrongs? I want to talk briefly about fairness, and your discussion this week is going to be on this. Fairness is a field of ethical study related to distributive justice. So when you have desirable and potentially limited assets, who gets what, on what basis, and who decides? This could include time in court for a hearing, time on operating tables for surgery, land, water, money, food. Recently, we have seen this playing out regarding vaccinations. Vaccinations are limited, rolling out slowly. Ultimately, they'll get to everybody, but when faced with this limited asset over time, who gets what, and who's going to decide who gets what? The three common approaches are equitable, meaning everyone gets the same, or in something like a vaccine that may be random. Merit-based, who deserves it, or need-based, who needs it the most. Conflict arises when people want to use different approaches to fairness. For example, food stamps or other public support. Do they go to the people who most need them, meaning that have the fewest assets, that are in most condition of food insecurity? Or do they go to people who prove merit for them by whatever, however you're going to define that, whether it's applying for jobs, taking drug tests, demonstrating that you do volunteer public service? Lastly, ethical consideration in conflict resolution should be given to who is at the table. Will your resolution affect the rights and interests of others? Are you deciding for them rather than respecting their autonomy? Should you consider the rights and interests of future generations? And how global and how long into the future should your considerations extend? And how do you balance that with protecting your own rights and interests today? I don't have any magical answers to any of those. And while there are legal enforcements for legal rights, there are not enforcements for ethical decisions that we make, which may or may not get played out in terms of how they affect our reputation, our relationships, and how the scenario is going to go into the future. And so that wraps up our 20-minute long brief summary of ethics and conflict resolution.